Will you please pray with me? Holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations upon all of our hearts be worthy in your sight and in keeping with the teachings of your Son, Jesus Christ, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. We have had a heck of a month, haven't we? And I don't just mean that as citizens of the world or even Americans, although I could mean it that way too. I'm just talking about members and friends of the United Church of Byron. We've had the death of Steve Bonte, of Norma Freeberg, and now Cindy Beidel. Various people getting sick and being diagnosed with illnesses. We've been busy with love meals and luncheons and providing food for the car show, picking up plastic bags and running meal trains. Then to add all that, we had a derecho show that blew out and knocked down our power for like everybody in the town and ripped up trees, not just on our property, but everywhere, really. It's exhausting, frankly. It just feels like one thing after another, and that's not even including things that can be happening in our personal lives. You might be worried about the church. After all, churches everywhere aren't doing well. It's no secret that attendance is lower in virtually every congregation after COVID. You might be rightfully worried, what if this is the thing that tips us over the edge? I say rightfully because I don't want to belittle anyone's concerns. People deserve to be heard and have their issues addressed. But I do want to offer some biblical-based encouragement for those who are worried. In both the Old Testament and the New Testament, God works best and clearest in the moments of weakness and impotence, when things seem hopeless. There are so many of these moments that I can't possibly go over all of them in one sermon, nor would you want me to. But I do want to lift up two different stories, one from each testament to prove this point. The story of the Exodus is a perfect example of God working in the Israelites' weakness. From the very beginning, the Israelites are in a place of complete and utter weakness. They cry out to God for help, and God answers, just not in the way that any of them expect. God calls on Moses, the disgraced man who is raised in the Pharaoh's house, to save them. Moses himself lacks faith in the plan that God lays out before him. He says it's impossible to get the people to listen to him, and even if they do, he can't speak to Pharaoh in a way that's convincing. And the Lord responds, "Now go, and I will be your mouth and teach you what to speak." But when Moses and his brother Aaron speak to Pharaoh, the ruler only makes life harder for the Israelites in servitude. God predicts this, saying, "Pharaoh will not listen to you in order that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt." It's only after 10 supernatural plagues brought on by God that the Israelites are finally allowed to leave Egypt and go to the promised land. The second example is the quintessential example from the New Testament, the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus and his disciples had been around to many villages and cities, preaching the gospel, healing and exercising people, and frankly, they're exhausted. Jesus invites the disciples away for a break, out into the wilderness to rest. But people have heard about what they've done, and they followed the disciples out. And Jesus starts to preach to the crowds of people, and he preaches so long that day becomes night. And the disciples tell him to send the crowds away. They need a break, and they don't have enough food to feed everybody. But instead of letting them rest, Jesus turns to them and says to the disciples, "You give them something to eat." The disciples protest. They barely have enough to feed themselves. But Jesus has the crowd sit down, and somehow, when they pass around those 5 loaves and 2 fish, there's enough to feed everyone with a lot left over. How did it work? The text doesn't say. But it is clear that the disciples, despite being tired and faced with a challenge, need to trust in God to provide. Both of these stories tell of a people in need, though completely different situations. The situations are outside of their control, they are physically and mentally exhausted, and they don't know what to do. They turn to God, and when God tells them to do something, they essentially say, "That'll never work." But as God tells Paul in the second letter to the Corinthians, "My grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness." This is what I mean when I say God's power shows through in our times of weakness. In times of ease and plenty, it's hard to notice when God is doing good things. It's easy to just assume that something good is happening because of our hard work or our ingenuity instead of God. And when things are going well, you don't always have a moment to sit and reflect, leaving a little room for God's voice to cut through all the busyness and business. Weakness, having no idea what to do next, forces us to step back. This is actually something that Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount. It's just not clear that he's talking about it. He says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Poor in spirit means reaching a point where we don't have control. Perhaps it's mourning. Perhaps it's helplessness. Perhaps it's not being confident. But poor in spirit is blessed because it opens up the ability to listen for God's voice and to see that help. Now, in those moments of being poor in spirit, of having no idea what to do, we can feel anxiety, the need to do something, anything. But that's exactly the opposite of what you need to do in those moments. What actually needs to be done is active listening, purposefully stopping what you're doing and listening for God, for where God is guiding you in that moment. This is really difficult because it goes against our natural human instincts. Our systems run on the idea of making choices in the face of danger in split seconds. Fight or flight, or freeze. But the Bible shows us over and over that God's voice takes quieting our own voices, our own demands, and listening. So why do I say all this? I say this because I'm trying to say that we have an opportunity here. If we are shaken from what we consider normal, if we're out of our comfort zone, then it's an opportunity to listen for God's voice, that we often can't hear over the hubbub of how we run everything day after day. COVID was the perfect example of this. I know Anne remembers this. The lockdowns forced us to sit down and think about what we are doing. We had no other option. And from that sitting and that listening, we started Love Meals as we know them today. And see how blessed we are by how we serve our community through that. If you feel anxiety surrounding our church or your daily life, if you feel our congregation or your own life is being shaken out of business as usual, then perhaps that is God trying to reach out, to get you to stop and listen for the voice of God that is still speaking. In promising us that our hairs are numbered and that a sparrow does not fall without the Father's knowledge or care, so it shows that God is with us in these moments. Regardless of what the future brings, rising or falling, God is still speaking with us and through us. I cannot claim to know the future, but I know that God is always here, still speaking. Amen.